2017 marks the 100th anniversary of the greatest battle in Canadian military history, and a moment of tremendous pride for Canadians. Vimy Ridge is often referred to as the battle where Canada became a nation, and the primary architect of this battle was Victoria, British Columbia's citizen soldier Arthur Currie. Through the course of the war, he gained great respect from men like Douglas Haig, commander of the British Expeditionary Forces, who had come to respect the colonial soldier. Currie had no qualms about disagreeing with his commanding officers if he felt their tactics were wrong, and he did not spare Haig. King George V would knight Currie for the Canadian contributions at the Battle of Arras, and British Prime Minister David Lloyd George regarded him as the greatest general of the First World War. Moreover, Lloyd George told his biographer that, had the war continued into 1919, he would have considered replacing Field Marshal Haig with Arthur Currie as Commander-in-Chief of all British and Empire troops. What makes his story all the more compelling is that Currie's fame and rise to success seemed so unlikely for a colonial soldier. Additionally, Victoria was one of the furthest outposts of the British Empire, tucked away on the west coast of Canada. It was there, in Victoria, that Currie forged his skills and confidence. On Monday, October 6, 1919, Arthur Currie made a triumphant return to Victoria after 5 years away from the city on the west coast where he had made his home from 1894 to 1914. He had left Victoria in 1914 virtually unknown beyond the city's boundaries, but he would return a national hero. The buzz and excitement in Victoria on that occasion cannot be overstated. He had left Victoria on the 28th of August with his 50th Gordon Highlanders as a local militiaman who had risen through the ranks of the 5th Regiment Canadian Garrison Artillery as a gunner, and he would eventually show promising ability in marksmanship and leadership. His reunion with Victoria was a culmination of a cross-country train trip from Halifax, where he had been joined by his wife Lucy. He claimed that it was the happiest day of the last 5 years of his life when the train carried him westward across the Rocky Mountain Divide into British Columbia. On arriving in Vancouver, the Curries boarded a steamship for Victoria. When he arrived, he looked at the harbor from the deck of the Princess Alice. Currie would remark, "Same old Victoria." But while Victoria did not appear to have changed since his departure in 1914, the life of Victoria's citizen soldier had changed significantly. The colonist would report the next day that, quote, "While he showed evidence of wear and tear and mental strain, he does not seem to have lost any weight, and he walks with the same erect carriage." But strain was evident to those who knew him before he left, and that strain did not have its origin only on the battlefield. The financial fiasco that he had left behind in 1914 made for a bittersweet reunion with Victoria and the social circles from which he so dearly sought acceptance. On disembarking the steamship at 10 a.m., Currie and Lucy were met at the CPR building by a reception committee that included several distinguished locals, including the provincial premier, John Oliver, Mayor Robert J. Porter, and his old friend, Major Walter Bapty. They then proceeded to the Parliament buildings, where they were joined on the building's lawn by upwards of 4,000 people, including members of his old regiment, the 5th, who had come to celebrate his triumphant homecoming. Mayor Porter had proclaimed Monday the 6th of October a half-holiday in honor of Currie's arrival. All public offices and schools in the area and surrounding municipalities would close for the event and not reopen until 1 p.m., so that citizens and children could be part of the welcoming committee. In addition, the 5th Regiment Band had been newly reorganized to provide the music for the welcoming committee at the Parliament buildings. From the steps of the Parliament buildings, Currie was, quote, "presented with the address of welcome from the province and a piece of silver from the Honourable John Oliver." Premier Oliver spoke in eloquent and glowing terms of Currie. Quote, "While we know that you have received well-earned recognition at the hands of the people of Canada at the national capital and other centers of our country. The province of British Columbia claims a just and singular pride in your distinguished leadership of the Canadian forces in France and Flanders, and asks your acceptance of a tribute of their respect, honor, and esteem." Currie was deeply moved and replied, quote, "It is difficult to express in a manner satisfactory to Lady Currie and myself our appreciation of this warm welcome on our homecoming to the city we lived in for so long." And he went on further to say that, quote, "I think BC enjoys the enviable distinction of having contributed more than any other province in men and materials towards the achievement of victory." Whether this was mere hyperbole or not mattered little to those in the audience, who cheered with tremendous enthusiasm. Accolades would continue in Victoria. At the Rotary Club on October 9th, the largest luncheon in Victoria's history would be held for Currie, with over 200 people present. Here Currie would discuss the impact of Canadian tactics. He claimed that the British Army would in future be remodeled in many important respects along the same lines as those adopted by the Canadians. Currie beamed as he recounted how he resisted Canadians being amalgamated into the British forces, and how they instead gained a reputation for their fighting spirit as Canadian units. The following day, Currie and his wife would attend a tea at the Empress Hotel, but it was a ceremony on the 21st of October at St. Joseph's Hospital, where the addition of an official children's ward was announced, that most greatly affected him. The kindergarten children of St. Anne's Academy, dressed in white, line the steps leading to the hospital off Humboldt Street, together with the Sister Superior and other sisters. The power for this moment for Currie came from his recollection of the tremendous role the sisters had played in France and Belgium in tending to the injured troops. Currie's reunion with Victoria was a very rewarding experience for him, and it also gave him a chance to resolve some of the loose ends that he had left behind in 1914. Opportunities would soon pull Currie eastward, and he would permanently leave the city that had contributed to the forging of his skills and confidence. Arthur Currie was born on December 5, 1875, and grew up in Middlesex County in a farming community near the small town of Strathroy, about 50 kilometers west of London, Ontario. His upbringing was relatively uncluttered by complexity, and his farming roots helped shape his character. By early adulthood, he was 6'3", affable, good-natured, and had an excellent memory. In addition, he had developed a fondness for literature and was very capable at speaking. His father died in 1891 when Arthur was only 16, leaving him no money with which to pursue his ambitions in law or medicine. So Currie trained as a teacher, achieving a third-class teaching certificate, which gave him certification to teach in a public school. But he could not find a job. As a result, he returned to high school, hoping for eventual admission to university. According to historian Tim Cook, Currie suffered from dark mood swings, likely instigated by the sorrow over the death of his father, and he questioned and challenged his teachers, who did not appreciate his tone. A month before writing his final exams in high school, he dropped out as a result of a conflict with a teacher and was unable to go to university, nor did he wish to return to teaching. At 19 years of age, Arthur left his family in May of 1894 to go west. The lure of the West, after the completion of the railway only a few years earlier, became a magnet for many young thrill seekers, and the ease of traveling by train would change the landscape of the country. The journey from Ontario to BC was 6 days long at a cost of $25. Along with several other friends in the same set of circumstances, Currie headed west. On his journey, as he snaked his way through the Canadian Shield in western Ontario, he marveled at the broad expanse of the prairies, only to be awestruck by the Rockies and the engineering feat required to connect eastern Canada with the west coast. At 19 years of age and brimming with an eagerness to start a new life, Currie would reach Victoria, where his maternal great-aunt Jane lived. She was married to Orlando Warner, a well-connected master shipwright. Both received him warmly and provided him with a new home and a stable life in Victoria, a city with a bustling population of 20,000, far exceeding that of his hometown in Ontario. The climate, culture, and the environment could not have been more different than that of the Ontario township he left. Although the Victoria of 1894 still did not include the Empress Hotel or the Parliament buildings, the predominant English culture made Currie feel like he stepped off a ship at Bristol Harbour in England. Victoria was more English than any other town or city in the Dominion, and its relative isolation preserved this English tone. In addition, the city had a mild climate, beautiful forests, and fresh ocean air. The Warner household was, according to H.M. Urquhart, wholesome and broadening, and appears to have provided the much-needed stability for a young man of 19. However, employment opportunities eluded him as they did in Ontario, so he entered a program that would qualify him to teach in BC. He completed his certification in 1895 and took a job, as Urquhart described it, in the scattered group of houses known as Sydney, for a salary of $60 a month. Sydney was located 20 miles north of Victoria on the Saanich Peninsula. He quickly settled in, enjoying the fishing, the social life, and the abundance of wild game for hunting on the weekends. He became a central figure in Sydney, being the only teacher in the local school with 30 pupils, ranging from the ages of 6 to 18 years. By all accounts, he was thorough, attentive, and had gained the full support of the school trustees. However, Sydney was extremely isolated from the bustle of Victoria, and the tug of a greater community drew him back in 1896 to take a position at the Boys Central School in Victoria. The move back in 1896 brought him much closer to the social heartbeat of the community to which he so desperately wanted to belong. The qualities he had as a teacher began to gain him respect from colleagues, and gradually connections were made in the social scene of Victoria. Currie had many positive qualities. He had a strong presence with his height, a deep baritone voice, he was energetic and had an excellent memory for names and faces, an attribute which would prove to be a significant asset in the trenches of Europe 20 years later. Despite his popularity as a teacher, he was not completely at home in that profession. Historians generally believe that the major cause of his break from teaching was a recurring stomach ailment, with which, during 1899 to 1900, saw him bedridden for months. During his time in a hospital bed, he reflected on his life and came to the conclusion that teaching was not his real passion, but more of a gateway to a more prosperous walk of life. Despite his disappointments with teaching, the connections he made through the profession did much for his next move. One of his colleagues was the instructor of the school cadets. His friend was fit and active, and under his instruction, the tall, lanky Currie, who slouched, would develop a much firmer physique, which in turn increased his self-confidence. With new connections, Currie moved into the next stage of his career, insurance sales. In 1900, with an official break from teaching, Arthur Currie started a new job as an insurance salesman at a local agency, Matson and Coles. Here he connected with J.S.H. Matson, who became a close friend and confidant. Matson's assertive and aggressive personality would have a very positive effect on Currie. He was well connected throughout Victoria, and he had many business ventures throughout Western Canada. Currie's relationship with Matson would open many new doors of opportunity in both the business community and in the social scene of Victoria. Additionally, Matson was a staunch conservative supporter, and despite Currie's loyalties to liberalism in politics, their differences never interfered with their relationship. Currie's income expanded to 3 times what he made as a teacher, and in 1904, Matson put Currie in charge of running the business. His years in insurance trade appear to have been fruitful and socially rewarding. And it was during this time, in 1901, that he and Lucy Sophia Chaworth Muster, the adopted daughter of his Aunt Jane and Uncle Orlando, were married on August 14th, and the relationship proved to be one that provided the love and stability missing in his life up to that time. His marriage also led to an increased social status because Lucy was English-born and very well connected. The pressure Currie put on himself to be successful and to be accepted by a closed culture of English high society in Victoria cannot be overstated. His marriage provided another gateway to that inner circle. It was Currie's move in 1897 that would define the career he would become most noted for. He joined a branch of the Canadian militia, the BC Brigade, Canadian Garrison Artillery, also known as the 5th Regiment. His military career began as a gunner, and it was in those early days when Currie, his name at the time spelled with a Y, changed it to Currie, spelled with an IE, to avoid, as Tim Cook claims, barrack room teasing along the lines of, quote, "Currie is hot stuff." Between 1897 and 1914, the local militia would play a central role in his life. The purpose for this interest was to not only show one's duty to empire, as a good imperialist should, but to socialize, exercise, and become more connected outside of business with the community. Arthur had no tradition of military training, and this was an opportunity to reinvent himself, smoke cigars and drink brandy with the boys while pontificating on the virtues of the empire. By 1898, Currie began musketry training and was promoted to the rank of bombardier. Despite his lack of a military background, Currie was a surprisingly good marksman, and his gun teams were always among the best in the 5th. On December 19, 1900, he was offered a commission which elevated him to the rank of lieutenant. He hoped to contribute to the Canadian efforts in the Boer War, but was declined medically unfit because of his ongoing stomach ailment. Between 1900 and 1909, Currie was promoted steadily, each time mastering the duties of his rank and showing strong leadership. He devoted himself to soldiering and commented that, quote, "When some of my associates were playing lawn tennis or swinging golf clubs, I was at the armories or on the rifle ranges with the boys." To enhance his knowledge and feed his interest in the military, he enrolled in courses offered by professional Canadian and British officers at the Esquimalt Naval Base. He would take every course offered, and to satisfy his insatiable appetite for all things military, he would purchase textbooks direct from military publishers in London at his own expense. While Currie could be very compassionate and was known for engaging the militiamen under his command in a friendly and personal manner, he expected strict discipline from his regiment. As Currie rose in the ranks of the local militia, so too did his employment opportunities. Part of the social backdrop, as Pierre Burton noted in his wonderful book on Vimy, was that Victoria had by far the most stratified society of any city in Western Canada. And there is little doubt that Currie coveted the status that a militia commission would bring in a community dominated by imperial officers, not to mention the upper caste of the British Navy stationed at the Esquimalt base. In 1908, Currie entered a real estate partnership with Raymond Power, which would begin one of the greatest challenges he would have to face before going on the battlefields of Europe in 1914. As a partner in the firm, Currie and Power, and with property value rising, it appeared that he could achieve a whole new level of affluence. The profits gained in the speculative fever of that time would have made his insurance takings appear paltry. All might have been well had the term real estate meant dealing in land on a commission basis, but it also implied in respect to Currie's firm, the buying and selling of land on account of the firm itself, a highly speculative business in which Currie had no previous experience. Vast profits for the firm would see massive reinvestment into newer properties, and this sort of trading encouraged Currie to be careless, as it did so many of that time, leading to predictable consequences when the property values would go bust. But as his financial fortunes took a turn for the worse, his military opportunities continued to blossom. In 1909, when the commanding officer of the 5th Regiment retired, Arthur Currie would take the helm, and for the next 5 years while he was in charge, the 5th Regiment won the Governor-General's Cup for efficiency in competition with all other artillery units in Canada. By the time Currie became commander, the regiment had had over 2 years to train with their modern 12-pounder quick-firing guns, which had allowed Currie's men to compete in Dominion gunnery competitions, the results of which were excellent. This success was due to Currie's dogged commitment, and he managed to average 150 nights a year at the armory as well as every Sunday at the firing range. The dramatic success of the 5th brought Currie's regiment to the attention of the Minister of Militia and Defense, Sam Hughes, who kept a close watch on his top leading militia officers. First contact between these two men came in 1912 when Hughes made a trip to Victoria to inspect Currie's unit, which now had achieved national fame in gunnery competitions. The initial meeting went well as Hughes praised Currie and the 5th, but shortly thereafter the two men came into conflict when, without Currie's knowledge, his second-in-command had given the okay for the 5th Regiment band to play for a church parade which had Conservative Party connections. Currie promptly canceled the event, and the local organization appealed directly to Hughes, who ordered Currie to let the band play. At their next meeting, Hughes had every intention of tearing a strip off Currie for insubordination, to which Currie would reply, speaking of himself, quote, "Did he or did he not command his regiment?" Many expected the worst, and certainly Hughes was taken aback by such a firm stand, but it worked in Currie's favor. When Hughes returned to Victoria, Hughes said, quote, "Well, Currie, I came out here to get your scalp, but you're right." While tension subsided in Victoria, it was not the last time that these two personalities would clash. At the same time, Currie's reputation was expanding well beyond the confines of Victoria. Currie's first test as a commander of the 5th Regiment in a crisis situation was dealing with a 12-month labor dispute known as the Nanaimo coal strike, which occurred in the years 1913 to 1914. At that time, it was one of the most bitter and acrimonious disputes in Canadian labor history. According to historian Urquhart, the strike was a clash between a group of mine owners and two powerful labor unions representing continent-wide interests, with the local authority trying to hold the balance between the two. However, in reality, the owners were backed by the provincial government. Since most of the miners were Central Europeans, it would appear that xenophobia was a major factor. And since the Bolshevik Revolution was still 4 years away, discrimination rather than communism was the catalyst. The crisis came to a head on August 12, 1913, when, as Tim Cook wrote, there was a pitched battle between 1,000 strikers and scabs, which soon brought in baton-wielding police, who only worsened the situation. 18 people would be killed as the strike reached its boiling point. As a result, Currie and the 5th Regiment, along with a new unit commanded by Lieutenant Colonel John A. Hall, known as the 88th Fusiliers, decided that action needed to be taken despite the government's continued waffling on the decision. Hall suggested that Currie give misleading information to the strikers as to the travel route taken by the troops as they marched up towards Nanaimo. The infantry and artillery thus took the strikers by surprise and entered Nanaimo without opposition. Currie and Hall would then have to disperse an angry crowd, and several strikers were arrested. Currie's pragmatism would rule out overreaction, as he made a point of visiting the strikers in jail on a daily basis, ensuring fair treatment while under arrest and also ensuring they had access to their families. At the same time, he urged the strikers not to take out their frustrations and anger on the Chinese community who lived in huts on the waterfront. Currie recognized the power of laying blame on others, and the irony was not lost on him that the strikers were doing to the Chinese what the mine owners were doing to them. Currie's actions diffused the situation, and he was praised in the Victoria Daily Times, which appeared to support the strikers. While the operation had boosted Currie's public image, his military career with the 5th Regiment was coming to an end. He was now a 38-year-old married man with 2 children, and after 15 years in the militia, he felt it was time to focus on his family and his business interests, which were rapidly taking a turn for the worse. By September 1913, his finances were in a critical state as a result of property values plummeting. As Tim Cook wrote, while he was a rich man on paper, his equity was tied up in property he could not sell. His creditors were on his back, and he had fallen behind on his taxes. If he could sell all of his properties and pay his debts, he may have been okay, but properties continued to drop in value, and there were few buyers. His dramatic financial fall was surely a major factor in his decision to leave soldiering, as he hoped to find a way out of his desperate financial situation. Just 1 month before his retirement from the 5th, a new infantry battalion was authorized for Victoria in August 1913. The 50th Regiment would be a Highland unit which would please the Scottish Victorians, who may have been a little apprehensive about joining the predominantly English 88th Fusiliers. This new unit would attract many of Victoria's Scots who were drawn to the kilts, bagpipes, and the traditions of a Highland unit. Although Currie had stepped down from the militia, many saw him as the perfect candidate for the new 50th Gordon Highlanders, especially since the previous candidate for leadership had failed to qualify for the post. When several of Currie's friends pressed him to take command, he scoffed at the idea, swearing and joking that he would look silly in the elaborate uniform of the Gordon Highlanders, with kilts, plaids, and feather bonnets. The minister, Sir Sam Hughes, had a special stake in the new unit because his son, Garnet, was a junior major, and clearly Hughes had his eye on Currie as a potential leader. In reality, he could not offer the energy or resources to build a new regiment during his personal financial crisis. Commanding officers were expected to devote not only enormous time to their regiment, but also significant funds, and this Currie could now ill afford. Not only were officers expected to pay for their own uniforms, but Highland uniforms were particularly expensive. As Jack Hyatt noted, with plans to have a pipe band of 16 and a brass band of 24 in addition to the elaborate dress of the Gordon Highlanders, it would be impossible for Currie to manage financially. Currie reconsidered his decision to take on the regiment when he learned that a local business leader, William H. Coy, had offered the regiment a grant of $35,000 in return for the position of honorary colonel. The offer did not specify what the money would be spent on precisely, as long as it benefited the regiment. Coy was praised lavishly for this in an editorial published by the Daily Colonist. Sam Hughes expressed profound gratitude for Coy's generosity, as did the Premier of British Columbia, Richard McBride, during a speech he made in the legislature. Most important for Currie was that the grant would relieve him of the financial obligation as commander that he otherwise could not meet. Assured of this financial backing, the expensive Scottish uniforms were ordered from Moore, Taggart and Company, with Currie signing the order. The agreement was that half the amount would be paid on delivery and the other half within 30 days thereafter. In the meantime, being impressed by Coy's apparent generosity, and despite a further decline in the real estate market, Currie entered into a speculative investment deal with Coy that turned out to work to his disadvantage. Coy insisted on heavily discounted notes from Currie, meaning that however the deal came out, Currie would owe him money. Currie would later explain this very unbusinesslike arrangement by saying that had he not agreed, Coy would withdraw his offer of the grant to the regiment. Before the ordered uniforms and kit arrived, the government sent the regiment a partial subsidy for the uniforms in the form of a check. Currie, along with other officers of the regiment, feared that if Coy learned about this, he would reduce or even totally renege on his offered grant. Coy had insisted that any money related to the regiment be deposited with the Bank of Nova Scotia, where he banked and presumably would have access to account information. In order to avoid any complications with Coy, Currie and the others decided to deposit the government check in Currie's personal account at the Bank of Montreal. When the uniforms and kit arrived in May of 1914, the regiment was able to pay the bill with the government funds in Currie's account, together with some of the money that Coy had deposited in the regimental account. Then a second subsidy check came of close to $11,000, which arrived from the government. This would have finally paid off Moore Taggart had Coy not contributed, but it was now no longer needed for uniforms. It was deposited, like the earlier subsidy, in Currie's personal account. Shortly after war broke out in August 1914, Currie was asked to assume command of a provisional brigade of the Canadian Expeditionary Forces at Valcartier Camp in Quebec. It was understood that this would lead eventually to a commanding position in Europe. At the same time, Currie's personal financial circumstances had only worsened, being now made even worse by his deals with Coy, who also still had not completely fulfilled his commitment on the regimental grant. For Currie's military career, this offer of a command was a great opportunity, but it would also provide him a break from the problems of his business life. He could not leave, however, without resolving his debts. There may have been other ways of doing this, but in the end, Currie decided, in an act of desperation, to use the regimental funds that had been deposited in his personal account. It appears that he had hoped to cover this from the remaining balance of Coy's grant, but Coy failed to deliver. He sought help from his old friend Sam Matson, who would be eventually reimbursed when his properties were sold. The harsh reality was that Currie, in an act of desperation, took money that did not belong to him. He had a wife, 2 children, and a reputation to maintain, not only in Victoria, but as well in military circles locally and abroad. One can only surmise that this financial sleight of hand weighed on his conscience during the most difficult years of his life when he was on the front. Garnet Hughes, the son of Sam Hughes, had been on friendly terms with Currie in Victoria, and was well aware of Currie's financial woes when they left Victoria for Valcartier Camp. The plot would only thicken later in Europe when Currie failed to support Garnet's advancement in rank due to what he regarded as a lack of competence, thus creating tension between Currie and Sam Hughes. On August 28, 1914, Arthur Currie would leave Victoria on the Princess Sophia, along with his own 50th Regiment and members of the 5th Regiment Canadian Garrison Artillery. The story of Currie's military success has been well documented, but there can be little doubt that his 20-year period in Victoria, British Columbia from 1894 to 1914 played a significant role in the shaping of the man he would become. How then do we judge Currie? We must consider the enormous social pressure which existed in Victoria. Currie's desire to be respected and successful would lead to a major error in judgment, but one which ultimately makes him human. So many of his generation fell into the same trap because they could not foresee the bubble bursting. Ultimately, his financial woes could not be excused, and he was under tremendous strain both on and off the battlefield. Without question, Currie's achievements in Europe were unprecedented for a colonial soldier, and the respect he gained from British officers and others was a result of his tactical observations and strategies, as well as his insistence that Canadian troops stay together. How his plight in Victoria affected his determination to be successful on the battlefield cannot be estimated. But surely his need to overcome his shortcomings in Victoria were a driving force in moving him to the greatness that became the mark of his military career.